Swinson. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome the fact that we're having this debate today in generally constructive terms. I welcome the helpful measures proposed to improve the accountability of our expenses, and I particularly welcome the withdrawal of the order to exempt MPs from freedom of information legislation. I was very taken with my honourable friend for Swinson Frum's contribution, and particularly his call for us to see ourselves as others see us, which he may not be aware is actually a quote from Robert Burns, and it's all the more appropriate because Sunday is when we'll be celebrating Burns Night, and I think that there's certainly a pearl of wisdom there that we should hold on to in this debate. We do need to admit that we have a problem with public perception. Survey after survey shows that when you ask members of the public, they tend actually to have a pretty positive view of their own Member of Parliament. However, their collective view of us as a breed of politicians, if you like, of MPs generally, is much more negative. And that's where a lot of these problems lie. Now, the issue of MPs' expenses is something which has just fuelled this negative perception, and it's been a vexed one, as has been mentioned by various members, for many years. It doesn't help that our expenses system is so poorly understood, and indeed I would argue that the media have been far less than helpful in sensationalising the whole issue of expenses. Indeed, the very word expenses is misleading because in most jobs, and certainly jobs that I worked in before being elected to this House, the types of things that we are claiming for would not necessarily be counted as expenses at all. Just to take the example, of course, we have these large headline figures of over £100,000 for most members each claiming in this House. But the vast majority of that money is being spent on the salaries of our incredibly hard-working staff who are dealing with constituents' concerns day in and day out, and who I'm sure other honourable members of the same experience, constituents very much appreciate the help that they give and continually give excellent feedback about them. Now, these are the salaries that are going to make up most of our expenses, and yet what newspaper editor, what managing director would include in their expenses the salaries of everybody who worked in their organisation?
Would the honourable lady
Certainly.
she makes a very powerful and important point. Would she not agree with me that, again, it's incumbent upon us to explain what we as members and the public are getting in return for those staffing budgets? And to put it very simply, if the sums available were much lower, the delays to constituents would be that much greater, and precisely some of the vexatious complainants about the size of the allowances would be the same people grumbling about the tardiness of our responses.
Honourable Member is quite right, because the service that our staff provide enable us to deal with, I think the Leader of the House mentioned over 3,000 cases in her constituency in the last year, and I don't think that would be unusual for most members in this House. The volume from speaking to members who have been here a lot longer of correspondence has increased hugely in recent years, and the advent of email, I think, is an excellent way for people to communicate with their MPs, but by making it easier, it makes it more accessible, and of course, therefore, the numbers increase, and the support required to handle all of those inquiries also has had to increase. There's also the point that I think many of our constituents think mistakenly that this money comes directly to us, as if it's paid into our bank accounts and then we pay out from that. And of course, we know the reality is that money only comes directly to us in certain allowances, for example, the allowance to pay for rent, only when you've actually submitted the receipt and the claim that you have already paid out your rent. And I actually remember as a new member of this House still having student debts and suddenly having to pay deposits and so on, actually finding in the first few weeks the cash flow was a little bit of an issue in that case. But so that is another misconception that people actually have. This whole second homes sort of phrase, as it were, makes up an image of a gravy train or sort of holiday homes, when of course actually the reality is that we get out of this place at 10 o'clock, 10:30 on a Monday and Tuesday evening, and just about manage to get back somewhere in London to put our head down and try to get a decent night's sleep before coming back here early in the morning. It's not exactly a glamorous lifestyle. I do absolutely love doing this job as Member of Parliament. I find it is a great privilege for me to represent the people of Eastern Bartonshire. But all of us here in this House know that it is far from easy. You know, we have the strains on family life, spending half the week away from loved ones, a huge amount of travelling which takes its toll in terms of tiredness and exhaustion. And it is the case, and I say this very clearly, without the support of my excellent staff, without being able to travel regularly between my constituency in Scotland and Westminster, without having somewhere for me to stay when I am down here in London, and without the resources to pay for my office telephone bills, my stationery, my IT equipment, I would simply be unable to do my job properly in representing my constituents in East Bartonshire. This is a case that is not often made, and it's one that absolutely needs to be made. And it's actually why I am so in favour of transparency. Because I do believe that when people are presented with the mundane details of our toner cartridges and our telephone bills, that the heat will go out of the issue somewhat. Constituents do, in the main, accept that we need to do our job and we need to have some resources to do that. Certainly will.
Has that exactly been the experience of the Scottish Parliament and the way the Scottish media have treated their expenses?
To come to the issue of the Scottish Parliament in a few moments, and in fact I would say that by and large that has been the experience, because to an extent, once everything is in the public, then journalists eventually get a little bit bored with the stories that they try to write on it. Trying to hide our justifiable expenses that we claim in the process of doing our job is what, in my belief, actually is damaging the reputation of politics. It's absolutely pointless. I mean, it's clear to see the way in which this is going. I will in a moment. It's counterproductive and it fuels the negative perception about politicians and indeed about this House. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I do appreciate the Honourable Lady giving way. While she's been talking, I've been thinking about this, and actually, I think what's happening is that the sort of seedier end of the press are sort of getting at those of us who are possibly the most diligent. Because those of us who are the most diligent and use all of our staffing allowance up, employing someone, and as she says, we don't see that money at all, that they are going to get on to us about that because they don't understand that it doesn't pass through our pockets, it goes directly to our staff. And the other thing is that those of us who go up to our constituency every week, as I do, and most of us do, our travel costs are going to be higher. If you go by train, our travel costs will be higher than perhaps using a car, although you can make a greater profit out of using a car. None of these things are taken into account. So last year I had to, I was told by my local paper that I was the highest spending MP in Bradford because my train fares came to more than the other four. There were all sorts of reasons for that, and it was only £20 more than the other one. So this year, I've started to use my senior citizens rail pass to reduce the amount of money I'm claiming or using. Sorry.
Should be brief, and I think the Honourable Lady has certainly made her point.
And indeed, thank you, Deputy Speaker. I think it's a very good point. And indeed, when I was first elected to this House, on the other end of the spectrum, I was able to still use my young person's rail card. So indeed, my travel bills went up slightly after my first year as a Member of Parliament. But I think the point that she makes is a good one. And that's why, again, I think transparency actually should be our friend. Now, we may not be able to guarantee favourable and always entirely fair treatment within the media, and I can't promise that that will be the case. But I think that our constituents, by and large, will treat us fairly. And that at least they're in the position to be able to assess if they see what the Honourable Lady or any other members' travel claims are and what their other expenses are, but they know how hard that individual MP works, then they can make their own judgments. And this is about making sure that people have the power to make those judgments. And they know that if they deal with the staff and that there's always a well-staffed office, and perhaps therefore one MP has got a higher staff cost than another, but they can actually see the benefit of that. And it's up to constituents, effectively, to judge whether or not we as MPs are spending that taxpayers' money well. Now, transparency, I would say, is a good principle for us to adopt. We've had the earlier discussion about the 26 categories that we're now going to have versus whether we should have every receipt published, which obviously, under the legislation of freedom of information, will also happen. Now, I do accept the argument that maybe if we'd had this better publication regime before, we might not have got to the stage where the Information Commissioner would have ruled that every receipt had to be published. But we are where we are. And we are now going to be publishing detailed receipts, 1.2 million of them, as we have heard. And I would argue that it makes no sense to stop there. that once we actually have done that, then we should actually implement a system to do that on a regular basis, and then it is entirely transparent. We know that there will be the freedom of information requests anyway, so rather than waiting for them to come in, I think the House should be proactive and take that step. And in a sense, what is the big deal? Yes, there is a cost attached, and the Leader of the House earlier gave a figure of £2 million. But I'm willing to bet that the public out there, who may or may not be listening to this and watching this debate, would think that that is a price worth paying for transparency within Parliament and for helping to restore some trust in our democracy. We've had a lot of discussion, some of it rather amusing, about whether this would be difficult to do with all the redacting that would be required and so on. But really, it's not that complicated. The Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly have both been managing to do this for some time now. Maybe our officials could speak to their officials and work out the best and most civilised, reasonable way of doing this. I quite liked the example earlier that there might be a standard receipt form that you would put all the details into, perhaps online, to save some of the work from the staff and the Department of Resources, and make sure the actual receipt was tendered for the auditors to look at. There's probably lots of ways that this could be done, and a streamlined system put in place that still makes sure all the information is in the public domain. Give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Leigh, for giving way on this question of the cost and the 1.2 million. Was the Honourable Lady as surprised as I was that the cost seemed to get to 1.2 million? Doesn't actually seem to be a rather lot of costs included in calculating that, because if one is merely scanning in pieces of paper, in fact, as a recurrent cost, the recurrent cost, in fact, would be extremely low.
The other point that needs to be borne in mind is this is a cost that is presumably for going back to 2004, so that's several years' worth of expenses, and if this was to be an annual cost, one would perhaps expect it not to be so high. And as I say, I think that there would be steps the House would be able to take to collect the information, if it was going to publish it in this way, to collect it in a more sensible way so that the process was made easier. I very much agreed with the sentiments of the Honourable Member for Cannock Chase in terms of the requirement for receipts, and I actually would be in favour, as initially was recommended by the Members' Estimates Committee, for there to be a zero limit on having to have receipts. When I worked in business before, that was the standard practice, and I can understand that there certainly are perhaps a bit more fiddly to put in small receipts, but I think that the public would welcome it. And I think if we're going to take a step towards transparency, we really just should go the whole way, and then we have nothing to hide and the public are very aware of that fact. And getting it out all into the open, it will just become routine. Now, I was asked earlier about the Scottish Parliament experience. Yes, I'm sure if we do this, journalists will still pick up on little stories. But, I mean, some examples of what's happened in the Scottish press. We've had a story about the MSP who claimed for the pint of milk or the packet of tea bags for their office. Well, to be honest, I don't actually see what the story is. You know, when I worked in an office, whoever nipped out to buy the new packet of tea bags or pot of coffee reclaimed the money from the petty cash when they came back and stuck the receipt in the petty cash tin. That's not a story. That's not something that's scandalous. And frankly, if that's the worst that the newspapers can come up with, then they're surely soon going to get bored, because they're not going to sell many papers by saying that there's tea and coffee provided in MPs' offices. The audit principle, which is before us in the motions today, I would say is also a very good one, and I'm delighted to see that the internal auditing will be more robust, but importantly that the principle of external auditing has also been accepted. I think that is absolutely essential, and that each MP will be externally audited at least once in a Parliament is the right way to go forward.
With the Honourable Lady.
I'll certainly write to my friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I think she comes to almost the most important point, and that is the auditing of members' claims, and particularly the external audit, because I think it's a protection for members as much as it is a protection for the public and the public purse, and it's something that I think members should look forward to rather than be afraid of. Just in passing, though, I do believe that she's a little bit optimistic to think that the full publication of all this is going to, in some way, diffuse the public interest. I think the public interest will be still there because certain of the public just take a delight in this, though I'm actually very, very much in favour of the freedom of information going ahead as it is.
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution, and I'm sure, yes, there will still be a great public interest, but I just think that some of the more lurid and scandalous stories would perhaps be abated, and indeed the perception that MPs are trying to hide something would be one that would be got rid of, which I think would be a very good thing indeed. And he makes a good point about auditing giving a degree of protection for members, because I think throughout all of this, and I'm sure most members have been of the opinion that we want to make sure that we're doing things properly, but there's also often been a lack of clarity and a bit of uncertainty about exactly what the right procedures are, and that you can stick by the rules but still somehow get into hot water, even having stuck to the rules. So I think a full transparency system has the advantage that, as the Honourable Member for Cannock Chase said, that basically you know that everything will be in the public domain, and that's then up to the judgment of your constituents. So turning, Madam Deputy Speaker, to what happens next. I had tried to intervene and hoped to intervene, the Leader of the House, to follow up on our exchange last October, when I asked the question when indeed the publication of our expenses was going to happen, because initially this was due to be last autumn. And of course the Leader has explained today in some colourful detail some of the difficulties that have been faced in preparing the material for publication, and indeed with some very important security considerations which have been outlined. But what I had wanted to ask, and perhaps in his summing up the Deputy Leader will be able to enlighten us, is that now that we know the scale of the task, and we know how many people we have working on it, and we know how much more there is to do, can we have a more accurate estimate of the date of publication that can be expected, so that the public can be reassured that this will not drag on indefinitely? And the final point I wish to make is about the issue of freedom of information legislation and who it applies to. This is one issue I still have some concern over, about whether there is going to be the prospect of trying to exempt members of Parliament from freedom of information coming back to this House. I asked the Leader of the House this question, business questions earlier today, and I know the other honourable members for Vauxhall and my honourable friend for Cheltenham have also asked for that assurance, which has not yet been entirely forthcoming. And obviously earlier this week there were some media reports which suggested that there had been some tentative agreement between Labour and Conservative parties on exemption from freedom of information, but that the order was withdrawn when that agreement collapsed. I do hope that there will not be any further moves to try to create another sort of agreement of that sort and bring this proposal back to the House. And I do hope the events of this week will actually be learned from, and that the suggestion of exempting members in this House will certainly not return.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. I don't know if she noticed in part of the proceedings before the order was withdrawn, it did go before another place where their Merits Committee looked at it and came out with what I gather in the language of the other places an absolutely damning conclusion that it may imperfectly achieve its policy objectives. I'm told that that is the strongest criticism that they make in another place against the statutory instrument, and therefore there may be some difficulty getting it through the other place, even if some unpleasant collusion happens in this House.
Well, indeed, we received in the previous bill that was introduced by the honourable member for Penrith and the Border by the other place, and I hope that it will not have to be the case that they are required to save us again from this. But if so, then that is perhaps of some reassurance to us. I will conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, just to say that it is in all of our interests to deal with this issue, to put it behind us, and to get on with restoring public trust. I believe the best way to do that is for this House to go down the route of full transparency. And I hope that, notwithstanding these new categories that are coming in, once the first tranche of freedom of information expenses have been published, the House will see that it would be the wise thing to do to continue that.